All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Schwanhauser, and I am the Special Events Manager here at Food and Water Watch. And today we are hosting our event about protecting Florida's manatees. So these lovable creatures are under threat from the fossil fuel industry and wastewater runoff from factory farms. And in recent years, toxic algae blooms have worsened, and this destroys manatees' primary food source. And so Food and Water Watch is working to hold factory farms accountable for their pollution and working to stop the fossil fuel power plants that are causing damage to these local ecosystems. And we are not alone in this work to protect Florida's manatees. We have some incredible guest speakers that we will be introducing in a moment here. But first, I have a couple of announcements and a few helpful Zoom reminders to share with you. So first, the chat box is open, so please use that to introduce yourself and share where you're joining from today. It's also where we'll be sharing some links during the event, so keep an eye out there for those resources. If you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, click on the live transcript button that you see in your Zoom toolbar to enable that feature. We are also trying to save time for Q&A at the end of our discussion. So if you have any questions for our speakers as you're listening, please use the Q&A box to send those in. And finally, I am recording today's event, and so I'll share that later with everyone who has RSVP'd. All right, I have a couple of upcoming events that I want to share with you before we get started. So next month, on August 17th, we will be talking about something that I'm sure is probably on everyone's mind, the alarming increase in wildfires and how this is tied in with worsening drought. The root cause, you guessed it, the fossil fuel industry and big agriculture. So next month, we'll be talking about our work to break this cycle of drought and wildfire. So we'll put a link in the chat for you in a moment where you can sign up for this. Then next in September, we're taking a break from Livable Future Live to bring you Against All Odds, our benefit to protect our planet. This is a hybrid event, so you can join us virtually like you are today, or you can join us in person in New York City for a reception. Whichever you choose, you'll enjoy inspiring stories from the front lines of our fight for healthy food, clean water, and a livable climate. Tickets to the benefit are a powerful way to support Food and Water Watch. With your investment, we are building the grassroots power needed to solve the most pressing issues of our time. So check out our website to learn more and to get your tickets to celebrate and take action with us. All right, so let's get to it. I am going to turn things over now to Brooke, who is our senior Florida organizer and a lifelong resident of Tampa Bay. Her work focuses on fighting for bold climate policies to move us off fossil fuels, which, as we'll learn today, is something that will impact us and native habitats and the health of creatures like manatees. So Brooke, I will invite you to join me.
Thanks, Kate, and hello, everyone. As a Floridian, manatees are near and dear to my heart, and I know it pains so many of us to see record numbers of manatee deaths throughout Florida this year. And that's why we're excited to have this webinar today to talk about how we can protect our sea cow friends. To get us started, we do have a short video to share. This video, called Back on the Path, was created by Jarrett Smith, a recent graduate from Full Sail University, who entered this film into the One Earth Youth Filmmakers Contest, where it won an Environmental Activism Award. It really helps set the stage for today's discussion. So after we watch the film, we'll hear from Jarrett and our other guest speakers, Dr. Robert Knight and Patrick Rose. So Kate, let's watch this film.
my name's Allie Greco. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for Save the Manatee Club. And my role is to do anything related to public awareness and education for manatees on behalf of Save the Manatee Club. Manatees are the only aquatic mammals that are herbivores, so they do not hunt anything, they only eat plants. And they don't have any natural predators in the wild either. They're big animals. Alligators and sharks don't see them as a threat, competition for food, so they don't have any predators. But they do face a lot of threats in their natural environment from different human causes. In 2019, we saw a record number of manatee deaths caused by watercraft collisions, boat strikes, and other accidents on the water. This is really upsetting because these are preventable deaths. These are things that people can prevent by being safe, watching out for manatees on the water, following those posted speed zones, looking around for them, just doing the right thing on the water.
The growth of an algae known as red tide has exploded in Florida this year.
Hundreds of sea turtles, thousands of fish, and dozens of manatees have died.
Dead marine life is washing up on thousands of miles of beach on Florida's west coast. The culprit is a toxic red tide algae bloom. It's actually the worst since 2006.
Red tide algae is a toxic, harmful algal bloom that occurs in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a neurotoxin. So red tide algae can cause neurotoxic effects in manatees and other wildlife, fish and dolphins. They might have trouble breathing. So when there is a toxic red tide algal bloom, manatees can drown, they'll have seizures or other neurotoxic effects from the algae. So it is a naturally occurring phenomenon, a seasonal phenomenon, but it can sometimes be exacerbated by fertilizers and other pollutants from human causes that are getting into the water and making these harmful algal blooms even worse. So some years it's worse than others. In 2018, we had a massive red tide algal bloom that hurt and killed a lot of manatees and other wildlife. In addition to the red tide algal blooms, which are primarily found in the Gulf or the west coast of Florida, there's another type of harmful algal bloom that occurs in the east coast of Florida. It's a blue-green algae. And again, that's fueled mostly by fertilizers, nitrates, phosphates, other chemicals from human use, so it could be from septic tanks or sewer leaks. This year, there's again been horrible, harmful algal blooms on the east coast of Florida, fueled from human activity. This is something that's been occurring and getting worse and worse each year over many decades, but we've sort of seen it come to a head in the 2020 and 2021 winter season. The Indian River Lagoon is a intercoastal waterway on the east coast of Florida. It spans many counties and many miles. It's a really important winter habitat for manatees. They're found there in the winter, especially congregating near power plant flows. So power plants are giving off warm water. They're releasing warm water into the lagoon, and manatees love that warm water. They need warm water to survive, and they're found there in the winter. So meanwhile, throughout the lagoon, there were these harmful algal blooms. They're being fueled by more and more pollutants. And when the algae is blooming, it covers the surface of the water and it shades out seagrasses from getting the light that they need to photosynthesize and grow. Normally in the winter, manatees will stay near warm water during the day. They'll go out and look for seagrass and things to eat, and then they'll come back there at night and stay warm. Unfortunately, this winter, with no seagrasses around, the manatees were kind of stuck near these warm water sites. They have nothing to go eat in the surrounding area. If they wanted to look for stuff to eat, they'd have to travel really far into cold water, which could be deadly for them. So ultimately, they had a choice. Go look for more food to eat and become cold and potentially freeze, or stay here in the warm water and potentially starve with no food nearby. And unfortunately, what they chose was the latter. So a lot of them stayed warm. Instinctively, they know they need warm water to survive, but they starved because there was no food in the nearby area. There are a lot of different things that people can do to help manatees in their everyday lives. if they're in Florida, whether they live here, they're visiting, and they're going out on the water, they're going to be around manatees, don't feed or give water to manatees. Even if you love them and you want them to come closer to you, this can alter manatees' behavior, make them hang around looking for handouts. We don't want to do that. We want to protect manatees by keeping them wild, keeping our hands off them, and just watching them passively. At home, you can do things to help manatees too. So if you live in Florida, don't fertilize your yard, or only fertilize when necessary at certain times of year when it's not the rainy season. Your county government or other local agencies should have guidance on how to follow Florida-friendly landscaping practices and other routines that help prevent fertilizers and other chemicals from entering our waterways. Save the Manatee Club does provide free resources to boaters or people who live in Florida, or just anyone who wants to learn more about manatees. You can go on our website, savethemanatee.org, and request them, and we'll mail them to you free of charge as part of our education efforts. If you have a boat or you know someone that has a boat, we have cheat sheets on how to look for manatees or report a sick or injured one. We have stickers with those numbers that you can stick on your boat or on your cooler, so you always have it handy. And if you know anyone with waterfront property where manatees are often seen, we have signs, outdoor signs that has that information as well that they can post.
What a great film to set the stage for our discussion today. If you want to rewatch or share Jarrett's video, we are putting a link in the chat, and feel free to share that with friends or watch the video again later. So now it's time to meet our panelists. So I'll ask the panelists to come back on camera as I introduce you. So we have Jarrett Smith, who is the creator behind the short film we just saw. We're also joined by Dr. Robert Knight from the Florida Springs Institute and Patrick Rose from Save the Manatees. Dr. Knight is an environmental scientist with more than 40 years of professional experience in Florida and nationwide. He is the founder and director of the nonprofit Howard T. Odum Florida Springs Institute, which works to protect and restore Florida's water resources. And we're also joined by Patrick Rose, who is the executive director of the Save the Manatee Club, which was featured in this film. As an aquatic biologist with over 45 years of experience, he is considered one of the world's leading experts on the Florida manatee. His organization works to protect manatees and their habitats for generations to come. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. And so now let's get started with our discussion. The first question goes to you, Jarrett. Let us know what inspired you to make manatees the topic of your film.
So in October 2021, as part of my classes at Full Set, we were challenged to make a short documentary. And what instantly came to my mind was how earlier that year in the news had been all of the Indian River Lagoon tragedies surrounding manatees. So it's just some early research I did to see if that'd even be a good topic was just looking at the manatee mortality statistics. And up to that year, 2021 had already been by far the record high leader in manatee deaths. And that really just kind of saddened me and made me upset because they're just so lovable and squishy and just, I just love looking at them. They're so cute. And I just wanted to do something about it, even if no one even ended up watching it outside of my teachers. It felt like something I wanted and had to do. And so as I did more, as I looked more into it, there's so many issues and it's so complex and there's just so much going on. So I hope I was able to get as much of that as I could into 7 minutes, but there's just so much more than what was even mentioned in that video going on.
Well, thank you for the film, Jarrett. We're really happy we got to view it here today. And now I'm going to turn over to some information that Jarrett's film addressed, which is one of the big issues we know manatees are facing. And that's an increase in the number and severity of algae blooms that are happening on both the west and east coasts of Florida. So my first question is going to you, Bob. Would you be able to explain for us what's causing these blooms and how they damage Florida's ecosystems?
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Brooke and Kate, for inviting me to be on today. And Jarrett, thanks for your film. It was very enlightening, very depressing too, like a lot of my work. Plants are good. Manatees eat plants, they're vegetarians. And so you've got to have light, you got to have nutrients to grow plants. And obviously you have to have water for aquatic animals like manatees. When you add light and nutrients and water, you can go too far with the nutrients. The light is pretty much fixed. We have a lot of sunlight in Florida. We also have a lot of cloud cover during different times, but in general, we have plenty of light to grow aquatic plants. And the thing that's usually limiting is the amount of nutrients that are in the water. And when you start adding excessive nutrients to water, you have the possibility of getting greater plant production. And one group of very primitive plants, I guess you could say, the algae, which are generally unicellular or very simple plants, grow the fastest in many conditions when you have excess nutrients. And in tidal waters, marine waters, nitrogen is frequently the biggest problem, the nutrient that has the greatest effect. And in freshwaters, phosphorus, especially freshwater lakes in Florida, phosphorus is the big problem. Those are two macronutrients. They're the two nutrients that all living organisms need the most, is nitrogen and phosphorus. And in that proportion, there's a lot more nitrogen than phosphorus typically. But when the source of these nutrients, of course, in nature, there are nutrients cycling in the environment all the time. And so natural ecosystems have been able to obtain enough nutrients to grow the plants that naturally occurred in those ecosystems. And those nutrient levels are relatively low under non-human conditions. But as you start increasing human population, you start creating wastewater from humans, you grow more food by using a lot of fertilizer, you have green lawns, all those things add additional nutrients to our water bodies. And that is what I think is the great cause. You've got the light already, and you added nutrients, and you got the water, and you're going to have algal blooms, either filamentous algae in the bottom of the water bodies or planktonic algae, microscopic algae that grow free floating in the water column.
Yeah, hey, Bob, what does the industrial agricultural runoff, what role does it play in this? And how has the state been able to control the nutrient pollution or not been able to control it?
I think most of the agricultural production in Florida is really at an industrial scale. There are definitely a lot of smaller farms, but they don't make up a very large percentage of the problem. The problem is really from large farms that are using large amounts of fertilizer. One estimate in the Springs region is about 300 to 400 million pounds a year of nitrogen is being applied to the land for growing crops. And then in addition to that, you have a very large contribution of animal waste nutrients that are in the water. And some of that, of course, that's expensive and it's used for growing the crops, but some of it always escapes, some of it runs off. And the state we have very good laws. I mean, on the books, they're very good. They say that you can't raise the nutrient concentrations above levels that are harmful to the environment. But those laws really aren't being enforced anymore. They were enforced much more in my earlier days in Florida, 30, 40 years ago, and up to even 20 years ago. We were enforcing our water quality standards in the state, had a lot fewer violations. There's much more lax nature about enforcing the water quality standards. So the state shouldn't be allowing what's happening, but it is happening because of a variety of reasons. But anyway, it is resulting in these algal blooms from all along the Atlantic coast and the Keys, all along the Gulf Coast, and our inland waters, including our springs and lakes. And this is a problem that's everywhere in Florida now.
Thanks for that description. So I'm going to turn to you, Pat. Could you explain more about how these algae blooms are directly impacting our manatee population?
Sure, and glad to be here. So the problem is particularly acute on the east coast of Florida within the Indian River Lagoon. That we have some problems in most parts of Florida, as Bob mentioned, but particularly in that system, those planktonic species of algae, the brown tides, the other phytoplankton blooms, there is so much nutrient coming in through our wastewater, whether it's from failed septic systems, improperly treated sewage, and then some runoff within on the East Coast is going to come from agriculture. But the two primary sources that are causing the most problem is coming from literally from human waste. And so knowing that and how severe it is, if you looked at how much seagrass was in that system, there were about 77,000 acres of seagrass, and is going back to 2010. In 2011, we had our first super bloom. And so we call this super bloom because they bloom so thick that it literally shades the light out and kills the seagrass below. And then that seagrass itself begins to die and puts more nutrients in the system. So you have a series of these algal blooms over time at passing those tipping points. And if enough of that food resources for manatees is eliminated and dies because of the algal blooms, the manatees are starving to death. And so we literally had 1,100 manatees die in 2021 total deaths. This year in 2022, it's not a lot better. We're already in the neighborhood of well over 600 manatees have died already. Not all of those attributed to this one source. But bear in mind, up until this time, in the last, say, 2 years, we really didn't have a problem with manatees starving. There was enough food for them and many more times the population for them. But it's because of the failures of literally to police, if you will, how much nutrients are coming in those failed systems, it allowed this to get so bad. We're on the verge of this happening in other places, but thankfully on the west coast of Florida and even in the Keys and so forth, it's not nearly as bad as this, but it will ultimately get worse if we don't address it.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of this has to do with how our state manages these runoffs from these major industrial polluters and from the human waste that's being released. I know that Bob mentioned that industrial agricultural runoff has been a contributing factor to the increasing rate of algal blooms in Florida. And I wanted to ask you, Bob, has there been an increase in industrial farming in Florida in recent years?
Well, there is in parts of Florida. You know, there's always been a certain amount of farming in Florida for the last 100 years. We're seeing a real expansion of industrial farming in North Florida as farmers are coming from California, where they've basically run out of groundwater in California in the Central Valley, and farmers, including big investment from Bill Gates and from the various carrot farmers in California, are now buying land in North Florida and bringing in industrial farms. So that is part of it. There's always also a lot of animal husbandry in Florida, confined animal feeding operations. The dairies in South Florida moved up to North Florida years ago because of the pollution that was polluting Lake Okeechobee and indirectly part of the Indian River Lagoon. They moved up to North Florida, and now we have some of the very highest nitrate levels ever seen in the Floridan aquifer, our drinking water, that are up to 10 times the drinking water standard for humans, and probably 50 times higher than the levels that will cause cancer. So, you know, the manatees, and the story with the manatees is shocking. And the Indian River Lagoon, I worked in it back in the 70s and saw the manatees and the fish and everything. And it has just totally changed because of these planktonic algal blooms. But we are seeing them in Kings Bay as well. And we're seeing, you know, the red tide on the Gulf Coast. And Pat's very familiar with those issues too. The septic tanks are just a ridiculous problem for Florida to have. We have about 2 million septic tanks, and these are systems, human waste disposal systems, that don't provide really any treatment at all if the nitrogen and other nutrients and pharmaceuticals and things that are in human waste, that septic tank runoff is polluting our aquifer in many areas and is polluting our surface waters in other areas. And yet the state continues to allow people to build new homes with septic tanks. It's just criminal that that's continuing to occur. There are, the state government ultimately is responsible for the problems, but the state government is a little bit hard to move off of, being the right government for business, and business is really having their way in Florida.
Yeah, the lack of inaction is something that Food and Water Watch fights regularly in order to pass policies to help address these types of issues. And one of them that Food and Water Watch is fighting right now is to protect our communities and ecosystems from the threats of big ag in our big agriculture. In fact, we are currently fighting to pass a bold piece of legislation called the Farm System Reform Act that would ban factory farms like the ones that Dr. Knight just spoke of. There's a link in the chat on how to contact your member of Congress to ask for their support. But big ag isn't the only threat to manatees, and septic tanks aren't the only threat either. We saw an influx of power plants 70 years ago into our state, and manatees began congregating in the warm waters put off by power plants along the Florida coast. So Pat, could you tell us more about this trend, why that's happening, the impact it's having, and the potential dangers it poses?
Yeah, so let's sort of lay it out. So in the beginning, power plants in terms of the thermal pollution have always been a problem. And because they're not really a healthy thing for the ecosystem in that respect. But Florida's also been experiencing so much growth and development and changes within manatees' natural, normal habitat that for a period of time, the actual once through cooling, which is the warm water created to return the steam back to water in order to essentially recycle it through the power plant, actually provided an aid for a period of time, if you will, to help manatees survive the winter when some of their natural habitat was no longer available. If you fast forward now, 40, 50 years down the road, yes, they've cleaned up how much, pollution is within that's released to burn those fossil fuels and so forth. But with climate change, we have got to find a solution to eliminating those fossil fuel productions of that, and also including that once through cooling water that manatees have become dependent upon. If it were eliminated in a quick amount of time, literally hundreds to thousands of manatees would die. We started working towards this solution more than 20 years ago, but have been frustrated by the slow pace of how it's going. Now we're facing the additional considerations besides the pollution that comes from the stacks. We're facing the issue with climate change and carbon and global warming and that whole exacerbated cycle. So the challenge is we find alternative ways that manatees can get to their natural springs and other passive warm water sites that will protect them in the winter, but do this over a period of time that it can be done safely. So that's the big challenge. And I will say I've been at this going on almost 50 years professionally, and I've fought against that whole time any new artificial warm water sources being developed. But it was necessary, if you will, to help as they cleaned up and burned cleaner energy over the time they repowered at some of those same locations. But make no mistake, they need to eliminate those going forward, have alternative energy production sources that don't don't rely on fossil fuel. But we've got to do it in a way that can be done safely for manatees. And if we put the time, effort, and money into it, we can do that.
And as far as that time frame, when do we need to get started on making this transition?
Well, we should have started, which we did 20 years ago, but it got interrupted. Besides the problem we've talked about, where more than 1,000 manatees have died because of the loss of seagrasses, we've also seen the situation by the Fish and Wildlife Service kind of neglect the good work they had done for decades past that helped the population recover and increase. Well, we're now in a downward turn, and we're going to see that exacerbated dramatically if the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's the chief federal agency responsible for protecting manatees under the Endangered Species Act, doesn't take this really seriously. And there is going to be a workshop this fall, but we're really behind on what we need to do. And I'll just throw in another thing that I've fought for some time, and I hope we're getting closer to getting it done. We want to see a surcharge go on every kilowatt of energy that's produced and go into a trust fund that so it can be used to essentially wean those manatees off those plants, look at that aiding and eliminating the fossil fuel production for electricity, and help make this transition, because it's going to be expensive.
Definitely. And that's something I do want to address later in our discussion here. But moving back to this shift in habitats, manatees have inhabited Florida for thousands, if not millions of years before power plants came along and created a new source of warm water. And the native spring habitats sustained manatees for the vast majority of their existence. So I'm going to turn to you, Bob. Could you tell us more about why manatees are moving to new habitats and how their native habitats have been shrinking from damage by humans? And feel free to jump in too, Pat, if you want to add anything.
Sure. So yeah, the springs really are the natural warm water refuge for manatees in Florida. I don't think manatees would really be living in Florida without the springs, and because they have to have warm water in the wintertime, or they have to run all the way back to the Caribbean, which is a long ways. So we have a lot of springs in Florida. We have over 1,000 artesian springs in Florida. We have the most large springs in Florida, 33 first magnitude springs. The total flow of the springs in Florida was over 8 billion gallons a day in the past. But things are changing. Once again, farming is part of it. Urban development is part of it, but we're pumping about 3.5 billion gallons a day of that groundwater now out of the ground for human uses. And so that was water that would have come out of the springs. And the whole state of Florida is dependent on groundwater. North Florida, it's really our only water supply for just about everything. And we're pumping so much that we've reduced the flow of the springs by 1/3. So that flow is critical for the manatees. Without flow, a spring is just a sinkhole, and it's not a thermal refuge at all in the wintertime. It'll fluctuate with air temperatures. And the other thing that's happening in the springs is they were a great grazing ground for manatees. They're naturally dominated by grass-like species of Sagittarian vallisneria that are very edible for manatees and other macrophytic plants, we call them. So they were just the perfect habitat for manatees, and yet for some reason the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has never designated springs as critical habitat for manatees. But with the phasing out of power plants and the increase in the manatee population, there's never been a better time to designate springs as a refuge for manatees. Critical habitat under the Clean Water Act is great protections. The federal laws can't be ignored by the state of Florida government, and they can provide some great protections for not only the springs, and all the other springs provide habitat for many other species besides manatees. But I tell you, they are the critical habitat in winter, and they're more and more the critical habitat along the St. Johns River to feed the expanding population. We're just overloading a few of the springs, like Kings Bay Crystal River. About 1,000 manatees or so are using that, and Blue Springs, Volusia Blue Springs, this tiny little spring, gets over 700 manatees in the wintertime. But we've got, like, Silver Springs probably has a capacity for 500 to 1,000 manatees as well. And we have several other large springs that are inaccessible. Silver is not accessible because of the silly Cross Florida Barge Canal, Rodman Dam. And that's why activists have been trying to eliminate that dam for 50 years now, half a century. Activists have been fighting that dam, and that would provide a refuge right away for hundreds and hundreds of manatees.
I might add that besides the history of our organization, which goes back about 41 years, and the work I did, it started before that, but we've been doing surveys and counts and so forth of manatee use of the various springs, particularly Blue Spring. We're actively working for the restoration of the Ocklawaha River, which Bob mentioned, Silver Spring, that would allow manatees to now have free access back to those waterways and those springs that was cut off because of man's dredge and fill and development. The pumping is really important. We started back in 2008 to push the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to redesignate critical habitat. Just this year, after filing a federal lawsuit, they've agreed now to go forward with that. So we're making progress that will include additional designations of spring habitat and so forth to make sure that those areas protected as formal critical habitat. And then I would also say we're very actively engaged in the water quality issues in addition to the other research and advocacy issues. We've unfortunately had to sue the Environmental Protection Agency over the fact that they weren't willing to reinitiate formal Section 7 consultation for the water quality issues that have led to the algal blooms that have killed the seagrasses and so forth. So we're going to actively pursue that along with other environmental partners, because that system is so broken that the standards that aren't even being met aren't sufficient. And so we have to get that looked at. That is going to direct also what the state of Florida does, because the EPA has delegated the water quality management even under the federal Clean Water Act to the state of Florida. So all that's got to be revamped. We've got to have better standards, and we've got to have higher accountability, if you will, through enforcement. Because right now, as these various permits are issued, they're presumed in essence to be doing what they promised they would do. And we know in most cases, they aren't.
Thanks for clearing that up, because it does seem like there's so much work ahead, but that both of you have mentioned how necessary it is for us to get these manatees back into their natural habitats. Going back to something you had brought up, Pat, though, about power plants and climate change. We know that in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change, we need to end our unsustainable reliance on fossil fuels and make a 100% transition to clean renewable energy. And what often goes unspoken, though, although not in this webinar today, is the impact fossil fuels are directly having on endangered populations like the manatees. The pollution emitted from these plants makes the waters around them more polluted, and their proximity to coastal waterways where algae blooms proliferate means these newer habitats around power plants are increasingly lacking the vegetation that manatees need to survive. So the harsh irony ends up being that the warm waters of power plants have attracted manatees away from their natural habitats and into these less ideal areas. An example, like where I'm from in Tampa Bay, is the Big Bend power plant that draws manatees annually and even has a manatee viewing center. But this plant is only miles away from where Piney Point began emitting hazardous waste into the bay last year, and near where Tampa Electric keeps open coal ash ponds. And we had hundreds of manatees die in Tampa Bay this year because of lack of food around Big Bend. And Pat, you said before that without protection of our springs, the manatees don't have a future. So I know we've gotten into it a little bit, but how can we transition manatees back to their natural habitats and away from power plants specifically?
So one, we've already dealt with, we've got to preserve all of our natural springs. We've got to make sure that they continue to flow and that manatees have access to where they are, because there have been other changes where spring may still be there, but it's not able, manatees can't get there. For example, the Silver Spring, they can go through locks and they're actually being killed and caught in those water control structures. So we need free and open access, and we need improvements. But beyond that, manatees are very adaptable, and they can find even small degrees of change in water temperatures. And there are many places in Florida that have deeper water that can hold the water temperatures longer, don't lose it so quickly as a shallow water habitat. And we need to work around those systems, improve them, and supplement those protections in those habitats as we're moving away from the industrial warm water that's created from the once through cooling, from that generation cycle. So it's not that power plants are doing a terrible disservice to manatees, if you will, right now, but because we need to get rid of all of that fossil fuel production, they have to go away. So we have to, again, find that safe way to transition that. It's going to mean more land acquisition. It's going to mean reshaping even the habitat, restoring places that manatees have been denied access to. Some of that can't be done because now human development, housings, and all the dredging and filling that went on in the Everglades, for example. But there have been examples, say in Port of the Islands, where they've already undertaken a project to return that in a passive way so manatees can stay warmer during the wintertime by reshaping that habitat using the qualities of the deeper passive warm water areas. It may even be that to get there, we might have to actually even do some solar production for warm water. And of course, that's going to be non-polluting in essence. It's going to use thermal heating from the sun to do that, but that may be necessary as we're moving away because we can't accept that for our whole climate purposes that we continue to produce our electricity from fossil fuels. But we can be creative, but it will take time, money, and effort, and there really is no time to waste.
Now you say it'll take time, money, and effort, and it sounds like a lot of that too is being able to fund the transition. Power plants have capitalized off of attracting manatees, both through greenwashing their operations and through saving money on expensive cooling costs. So this question goes to the panel in general. What level of responsibility do you think power plants have in transitioning manatees back to their natural habitats?
Well, I'll speak very strongly and have been for a very long time. They have saved billions of dollars because there were other methods to deal with the thermal side of it. They can use cooling towers. They could have had closed systems that don't go into the ambient waters in these other habitats. They chose very directly to save money to use once through cooling. Therefore, they're absolutely responsible for the consequences. And so they are on the hook to fix this problem. And so from my perspective in our organizations, we're going to be unrelenting on holding them accountable to be a part of that solution. But it has to go hand in hand with our federal government using the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and not allow these systems to just go away and result in the take or killing of hundreds or thousands of manatees when we can safely do that. So they're 100% responsible as far as I'm concerned because they did this knowing they were going to be saving money.
Yeah, and as far as that is concerned as well, Florida is incredibly friendly to utility companies and often allows them to pass off their costs to ratepayers. And so I know from my work as an organizer, it's really important that we make sure it's the polluters who are putting profits first are responsible for footing this bill. So how much of this pollution is coming from the polluting industries versus coming from everyday Floridians?
Well, maybe I'll try, then Bob may want to add to this, just speaking specifically about the power production. And it may sound like I'm going to defend them for a minute, but I just like to keep things in context. So in terms of air pollution and what's in the particulates and the source of fuels that have been burning and so forth, they've been getting cleaner and cleaner in the process. But cleaner and cleaner is, of course, not going to do what we need done. It needs to be eliminated. But I just want to let you know, if you go back 50 years ago where they were burning more coal and they were burning more fuel oil and so forth, most all of those facilities, except for a couple of exceptions, I won't call them minor, they're using natural gas. But in terms of the carbon and climate change, it's better in terms of particulate, but it's not in terms of solution for going forward. So I just want to recognize that happened. And then as they have to make these changes going forward to eliminate, they're going to have to go to alternative production, whether it's solar, which Florida Power and Light, for example, is going very heavily into solar. Duke, I believe, is going into solar strongly, but that's still not enough and it's not fast enough. To the ratepayer side of it, I wish there were a solution, and I wish these companies had put away, which is what I wanted them to have to do, money into a trust fund where it would have been there when we're facing these kind of problems. Then maybe we could say it all needs to come from, the savings that the companies made in the past. Since that hasn't happened, I suspect it's going to have to be a combination of the part of their profits together with some part of that being from the ratepayers. I don't know any other solution to that. I hope there could be one. I hope our federal government can kick in too, in terms of the fact that they allow these things to happen and go forward. But again, it's non-negotiable. We have to fix it. They need to eliminate the fossil fuel in terms of electricity production, but it's probably going to have to be a shared cost in order to get to where we need to go in at the time we need to get there.
Yeah, and as far as the choices that we as individual Floridians make, how much of that are we responsible for of this pollution versus the different industries and larger corporate actors that you've mentioned here today? Like, how much of the onus is on us as an individual versus on these massive corporations?
Well, maybe I'll answer, maybe not the way. So I take this very personally myself. So when I moved to my current location, I designed and installed a 14.9 kilowatt solar power system. So I'm net zero. I actually produce more through my system than what we consume. And so I personally take that a very great responsibility in trying to keep my footprint to a negative if I possibly can. I'm certainly not perfect, but it was a big way for me to make a difference personally. And so when people have that option to do that, that's great, but not everybody has that ability or option to do that. And they are dependent on these electric utilities in order to have their electric generation, whether it's like this summer to keep them cool enough from being too hot and the medical problems or whatever it is. But so I think it's a shared situation, and maybe Bob, others have more to say about it, but I think we all have sort of benefited from the grid and all those things that have happened there. But it's time for us to demand as consumers and people who care about the planet that we move to a way that we're not causing exacerbating climate change and all of these other factors, whether it's the direct thermal pollution or air particulates, in addition to the carbon issue.
Brooke, can I add a little?
Yeah,
So
of course.
the Florida Springs Institute focuses on restoring and protecting springs in the future, and it's a big job because our government has let things get pretty bad. Like I said, we've lost about a third of the springs flow. In addition to that, we've increased the nitrogen pollution in our springs just beyond belief. Over 80% of our springs are above the state's numeric standard for nitrogen. And that has caused plant community changes in the springs as well, where we've lost the native vegetation that manatees like to eat and other wildlife. We're interested in all the wildlife, like I said, not just the manatees, but we need healthy springs for the manatees. There's no doubt about it. And we can get there without spending a lot of money. The bad actors are really a relatively small number of corporations. I mean, small compared to the number of people in Florida. There's about 30,000 permits for large withdrawals of groundwater in Florida, about 30,000 permits from the Springs country. This doesn't include South Florida Water Management District, but includes 27 million acres in North and Central Florida from Lake Okeechobee north. Those permits are the ones that are responsible for well over half of the groundwater withdrawals, and they're in turn, those corporations are providing about 90% of the nitrogen pollution that's in our groundwater. So there's nothing, if everybody in the state that's not one of those corporations cut back on their water use and their nitrogen disposal, it wouldn't solve the problems. The problems really are very highly concentrated in a relatively small number of corporations that are profiting off of not having to pay for their pollution and not having to pay for the water. And so the easy solution to this is, first of all, to put a price on groundwater not to make it a commodity that's for sale on the market, but a price for everybody that uses groundwater, which is everybody in Florida, should pay a price for that. And that money should go back to protecting the resource. And also there should be a higher price on nitrogen and fertilizer, so that anybody using fertilizer is helping pay for the things that will mitigate the effects of the problems they're creating. And also people with septic tanks, they need to be paying a rate just like other people that have, urban wastewater treatment systems. They need to be paying for the pollution that their septic tanks are causing. That's a slight tax, but the biggest financial impact should be on the corporations that are just profiting off of free water and free right to pollute. At least that's my opinion. I've just written a book called Saving Florida Springs, a prescription for Springs Health, that details that. I think it's a pretty simple formula for protecting our springs, and that's not the whole solution for the manatee issue, but it's certainly, hopefully it's the future for the manatees, is that we can support a large number of them in our springs during the wintertime.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so that kind of gets us to the solution, which is, not only do we need to be educated on these issues and share them with our friends and family, we need to, as citizens, be engaging in advocacy to stop these corporate polluters that you said are the handful that are really contributing over 90% of the pollution that's causing this problem. Also, I would encourage folks to get involved with groups like Save the Manatees, the Florida Springs Institute, and Food and Water Watch to find ways that you can get involved in that type of advocacy. So I'm going to go ahead and close this with a question to you, Jarrett. In making your film, let us know, is there something that you learned about the situation about manatees that you feel more people to know or need to know, or something that surprised you that you found out?
One thing that definitely surprised me was just how many issues there are. I mean, even just the stuff we've talked about today, there's a lot going on, whether that's, energy runoff and pollution, or farm runoff and pollution, or trash in the water, or whatever it is. There's a lot going on and there's a lot to do. And I think a lot of people, especially people who don't really go out of their way to research and look into manatees, know just how harmful it can be, or just don't care. And it's just something that we have to, be enlightened on and know and research ourselves. And no one's going to do it for us. Manatees are only at the place they are today. They're so plentiful compared to how they were back in the 60s and 70s because of research and action that we did. So one thing that I learned and what surprised me was just how much we can do. There's a lot we can do, and how much there is going on, and just research and knowledge really helps with all of that.
Well, thank you so much. We're so happy to have had the film today and to have our panelists here. And as we promised, we will now go to take a couple questions from our audience. So we had one question that was submitted ahead of time from Jacqueline Texier. Apologies if I pronounced the name wrong. It says, well, stopping fossil fuel entities from moving forward, is there also a way that we could harness or make harmless the toxic algal blooms? Is there something we can do to fix it, or is the best to go back to the source? And I'll put that out to anyone who wants to answer.
Well, I think I'll jump in on it. So there are actually people that put themselves forward that they can clean up the toxic algae and sort of fix it, but really those don't work. And so what we're going to have to do is stop those excess nutrients that Bob mentioned as well that are coming into the system, whether they're coming from agricultural or those millions of failing septic systems or improperly treated wastewater that's not being treated to an advanced level. So it's broken so bad, there is no magic solution. There's no way to filter all this out in order to fix it. So it's just basic. And I would say on the idea of advocacy, what's more basic than human waste when it comes to that form of pollution in terms of the infrastructure? So there's a lot of going on in Washington right now in terms of different funding for different projects that one day it looks like it's going to happen, maybe the next day not. But if folks get involved, let them know their elected officials, their state senators and congressional representatives, this is important to them, get very active. We try to lay out a lot of this on Save the Manatee Club's website, savethemanatee.org. It can give you more history on all the topics we've talked about, but also how you can plug in and get a hold of your legislators as well on these important issues, because it's millions of areas where there are sort of those cuts, if you will, millions of cuts that are going on. And so it's going to have to be a comprehensive solution. There's no magic bullet.
Just if I could add on to that real quick, even if you don't live in Florida or you know someone that lives there, please inform them, ask them to look into this themselves, ask them to vote. And even if you don't live in Florida, you can help through voting and writing to your state legislators. It's not a hopeless cause, especially in the federal level. There's a lot of things that we can all do. And especially this year with midterms coming up, voting is the most important thing right now that a lot of us not located in Florida or Georgia or South Carolina can do to directly help manatees.
Yeah, thanks for that. I believe we have time for a quick answer to one other question. This one is submitted live. In the Indian River, we face a true dilemma. 90% of the seagrass has vanished and many manatees are starving. How can we begin reseeding and growing seagrass and not have it immediately eaten by hungry manatees? How do we restore both?
Yeah, so this is all actively going on now. There are actually plantings going on as we speak in the tributaries, the freshwater rivers, the systems that feed it. First of all, we've got to have water quality that's sufficient to be able for that seagrass to grow, whether it's natural reproduction or planted. So that's the first challenge. There are ways to restrict the areas, cover them, and keep the manatees from eating it. That's been successful in places. You can cordon that off. So, but the big problem, the most exacerbating issue is that the water quality itself has to be restored and available. So around our inlets, it's many cases already clean enough, if you will, because of the flushing and the seagrasses can regrow already. But until we literally have the water quality, and that's what our EPA lawsuit's about. It's really to get the Environmental Protection Agency to recognize and put forward better and improved regulations.
Thank you so much. And so we are getting near the end of our time. I want to thank our amazing panel for joining us today. I know that we've only touched the tip of the iceberg on the amount of knowledge that you all have. And I really look forward to working with you closer as we continue our fight to end factory farms, fossil fuels, and protect the manatees and our climate in the process. We've spoken today about two major threats that we're facing: fossil fuels and factory farms. And no matter where you live, you can help by taking action today to ask your members of Congress to support two important bills. As previously mentioned, the Factory System Reform Act, FSRA, would ban factory farms, and the Future Generations Protection Act, the FGPA, would ban fracking and stop new fossil fuel power plants. There are links in the chat to send a message, but I just want to finish by saying to remember that we win by fighting for policies to stop the polluters who are putting profits before people. And that's how we win these fights. So now I'm going to turn it back to Kate, who will share with you how you can also help to get involved to help Food and Water Watch win.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. And huge thank you, Jarrett, Pat, and Bob, for being here with us today for this really important conversation. I personally found it really eye-opening. As Jarrett said, there are so many interconnected issues that play into this. And through your conversation, I learned so much more about those connections. So thank you all again for joining us for this today. And, as they shared, advocacy is so important in solving these issues. So in addition to what Brooke just mentioned, another great way to get involved is to volunteer with Food and Water Watch. Volunteers are critical to our campaigns, and we are so appreciative of your support. So if you are interested in getting more involved, you can check out our volunteer dashboard where you can sign up for shifts near you, as well as virtual opportunities that you can do from anywhere in the country. Our monthly central volunteer meetings are a great way to get started. So be sure to look for that on the dashboard, and we'll put a link in the chat where you can check out those opportunities. You can also make a huge impact by making a gift to Food and Water Watch to strengthen our campaigns to fight the fossil fuel industry and to ban factory farms, which keeps our ecosystems healthy, livable habitats for manatees, and stops the worst effects of the climate crisis and protects our planet for generations to come. We will put a link in the chat where you can make a gift today, or you can text the word gift to the number 23321 on your cell phone, and you'll get a link where you can donate from your phone. So before I let you all go today, I just want to remind you that you can save your spot at some of our upcoming events. So next month on August 17th, as I mentioned earlier, our next topic will be talking about the cycle of wildfire and drought and how we can fight the same bad actors that we were talking about today to put an end to that cycle. And finally, I invite you to join us again in September for Against All Odds, our annual benefit where you'll hear from special guest speakers, we'll celebrate our victories, and we'll mobilize for the work ahead. As our guests shared today, when we organize and come together, we have the collective power to take meaningful action. So Food and Water Watch will keep fighting no matter the odds, and we know that we can take on these corporations and fossil fuel companies, and we know that we can win with your support. So I hope that you'll join us in September for that. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Later this afternoon, you'll get an email or a text message asking you to submit feedback about today's event. So please leave us a comment. Your feedback is really helpful to us. And then later this week, I will send out the recording so that you can rewatch this or share this with friends and family. And I'll also share some of the links that we shared in the chat today. So keep an eye out for that as well. So thank you all again. We appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon. We'll see you next time.